I'm walking in the ancient ruins of Qumran. Qumran was a Dead Sea community that thrived about the time that Jesus was alive. The Dead Sea is about a mile over in that direction. Now, in the mountains behind me are caves, and in those caves were discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many people believe that those scrolls were actually inscribed here. Also, many scholars believe that John the Baptist lived during some period of his life in or around or near this place.
About 100 years before the birth of Jesus, there were pious Jews who came out to the Dead Sea desert area in order to create their own community. This desert settlement was destroyed by the Romans in 73 AD during the Great Jewish Revolt. Starting in 1948, in the caves around this community, hundreds of scrolls were discovered, including almost the entire Old Testament. You see, the people who lived here just before the Romans invaded apparently hid these scrolls in caves to protect them. And then one of two things happened. Either these Jews died at the hands of the Romans, or they fled, hoping someday to be reunited with their beloved scrolls. But they never came back, and the memory of where these scrolls were hidden died with them. Almost 1900 years passed, and all of these documents have now been discovered. As we explore these caves, we think about what these scrolls tell us. First of all, the 39 Old Testament books that people had before 1948 had all been translated from Hebrew manuscripts that were no older than the 11th century. But the Old Testament books that were found here were written 1,000 years earlier. And what we found is that the 11th century Old Testament manuscripts and the Qumran scrolls were virtually identical. It's obvious that in the first 1,000 years after Jesus, Old Testament copyists were extremely careful to transcribe their scriptures. And before that, they probably always were. So what does that tell us? It tells us that you can trust your Old Testament today, just as if you were reading these books right after they were written by the original authors. Now, the people of Qumran collected more than just books. They also collected water, because like the Bible, the water was life to them. So they built many cisterns here for collecting water. Here is a cistern that is cracked, and we know how that happened. There was an earthquake. You see, in 2012, geologists were doing research in the Dead Sea area, and they discovered that there was an earthquake that occurred here sometime between 25 and 35 AD. These findings were published in the May 2012 edition of the International Geology Review, and this earthquake would have been felt 16 miles away in Jerusalem. Now, we read from the Gospel of Matthew that there was an earthquake on the day that Jesus died and on the day that he rose from the dead. And 25 to 35 AD is the exact time frame in which Jesus died. In Jerusalem, you can even see a crack in Mount Golgotha that is believed to be the result of that same earthquake. So what does that tell us? It tells us that modern science confirms the Bible. Now, when John the Baptist was a young man, his parents died, and he went into the desert and re-emerged at the age of 30 when he started baptizing in the Jordan River. But was John ever a part of this Dead Sea community? Well, there are 3 clues that tell us that he was. First, when John started baptizing, he did so in the closest place from here where there is fresh water, a spot in the Jordan River just a few miles to the north. That is clue number 1. Second, John's style of baptism was something that no one in the outside world had ever heard of. It was called a baptism of repentance. And when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we learned that the people of Qumran apparently had the same idea. You see, there was a book written here that was called the Manual of Discipline, and this book described how a candidate for admission into this community had to go through a baptism of repentance before becoming a permanent member of the settlement. That ties John to Qumran, and that is clue number 2. The third clue is this. The Qumran residents were expecting a Messiah, and a manuscript was found here called the Messianic Apocalypse, which was written before Jesus was born. This document says that the coming Messiah will release the captives, open the eyes of the blind, lift up those who are oppressed, heal the sick, raise the dead, and bring good news to the poor. Now in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, when John sent his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus responded by saying, "Go tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." Now, some of that is from the book of Isaiah, but the part about healing the sick and raising the dead is found only in the Messianic apocalypse. If John had lived in Qumran, he would have been familiar with this quote, and that is probably how Jesus confirmed to John that he was the Messiah, by loosely quoting a passage from the Qumran library. And once again, that ties John to Qumran. We've known for 2,000 years that Jesus is the Messiah, because he not only fulfilled John's expectations, but he also fulfilled hundreds of scriptures from the Old Testament that tell us that he is the one who was, who is, and who is to come.